Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Vectra AI podcast, where we in the Vectra product team talk about stuff we hear, what we learn, what we're working on, and occasionally rant on topics we're passionate about. My name is Tiffany Nib, and I'm a product marketer on the product team. Today, I'm joined by John Mancini, our principal product manager. Today's topic is a threat briefing on hybrid cloud attacks, where John will explain the current state of hybrid cloud environment and the change in the landscape around attacks in this environment. With that, I'll hand over to John.
Hi all. Let's jump right in. So currently, cloud usage is growing, but what we're seeing is that at the same time, the hybrid enterprise, as we know it, this hybrid enterprise being the fact that folks are still going to be using kind of on-prem technology, is persisting. So what you're looking at here is the results from a Gartner report, public information here that they posted, that basically talks about the billions of dollar increase we saw in terms of cloud spend, both from the platform as a service. This is kind of using native SaaS technology or native cloud technology, and then from an IaaS, the lift and shift aspect of the cloud. All saw significant increases in 2023, with even greater increases projected into 2024. However, if we look at kind of what this represents as a fraction of the cloud environment, is 30% of enterprise applications are in the cloud as of 2023. So that means that today there is, by and large, still mostly on-prem traditional deployments. And the path for us getting to a place where everything is in the cloud is a long, long journey for us, because ultimately right now we're looking at 2027 to have 50% of workloads in the cloud. So what this translates to me is that ultimately the landscape with which defenders are going to be monitoring and protecting is going to be this joint world, this hybrid enterprise of both network and cloud assets for a very long time. And it's important to understand that in the last year, we saw the most attacks that we've ever seen, essentially, in that kind of cloud domain, as that 30% of workloads are starting to increase. So what you're looking at here is kind of some metrics that were pulled from Wiz's cloud threat landscape kind of technology that they put out, where they've been collating all the attacks that have happened in the public cloud in the past, in the recent period. And what we see is, if we track the 2022 to 2023 numbers, there's been essentially a 200% increase in cloud attacks through that period of time. And then if we project that forward, we're looking at a similar 200% increase on top of that going into 2024 in terms of number of attacks that we're seeing publicly reported in the public cloud. So this ultimately means that while there is still not that full saturation of public cloud, it is 100% now part of the attacker vernacular in terms of kind of where they're moving their attacks and how they're operating. And it's an interesting one from a defender's perspective, because while it is still, while the network remains, the interaction path that now comes from the cloud isn't just +1, it's actually plus a lot, because from an attacker perspective, yes, they can go and directly connect into any of these different cloud or network or identity spaces to run their attacks. But it's not just protecting that initial gateway that's important, because ultimately the means that attackers have today to navigate is incredible. They can spit and spin from any of these different landing pads into any of the other ones. And we see this now across the different attacks that have been reported in the recent period, of how attackers get a hold in one domain and move into another. And to kind of give you an example of what that looks like, I'm going to run through one attack that I think really is effective at capturing kind of an example of what an attack looks like that pivots through this domain. So the attack that I want to focus on is from this kind of threat group. Mango Sandstorm is at least the starting kind of attacker that was documented in this incident. And so this attack group, they start off their attack completely traditional. So directly exploited an internet accessible asset, so connected directly into a network, started to run their attack there. They're a ransomware group, so they use traditional ransomware-centric attack tactics. You've seen kind of some of our other podcasts about kind of ransomware attackers everything I say there about consistency of behavior applied to this. The attacker went through, did discovery, gain access to credentials, move laterally, rinse and repeat. And on the way, they basically modified GPO policies to disable essentially EDR. They started staging ransomware to deploy for kind of encrypting assets, and then started to exfil that data out as a means of kind of proof of life that they wanted to capture. Now, what things get interesting though when you look at kind of the next step, because at this point the attacker could have deployed their ransomware, demanded basically their fee, and had an attack that would have been semi-successful from the attacker perspective, but the attacker was able to identify assets in the cloud. And so what they were able to do is, using a tool called AD internals, it's just an open source tool, they were able to access a set of credentials from the endpoint and use them then in the cloud. So this AD internals tool was run on a specific endpoint, the Azure AD Connect server. And by running this AD internals tool, specifically a get sync credentials command, they're able to resurrect a credential and a password that could be used. It was a machine account, so there was no MFA on that account. Using that account, as well as another admin account that was discovered over the course of the attacker's kind of navigation through the environment, they were able to directly sign in to Azure, into Azure AD, Entra ID, and Exchange, and start doing recon there. And so essentially, all the activity on the network directly translated into a path for the attacker. What's super interesting here when we talk about MFA and prevention is that the attacker actually was relaying all their commands, it looked like, through the network itself. So what that means is that they were able to use these credentials from endpoints inside the organization's network. So no MFA ever prompt was necessary. They're able to reuse already authenticated sessions to move through. No conditional access policies were invalidated. Everything looked normal as they would have expected and wanted to. All that recon in Azure, Azure AD, Exchange ultimately translated into then cloud-specific persistence. So they started creating OAuth apps, started manipulating Exchange to enable send on behalf of functionality, a bunch of things that are very cloud-specific for the attacker to really gain a hold of the environment. That hold of the environment ultimately translated into the last stage of this kind of ransomware incident, where the attacker actually had access to the Azure console and was able to then use that to interact with that IaaS infrastructure to essentially delete VMs, storage accounts, virtual networks, all this, effectively denying service to this organization at a level which is, in some ways might argue even worse than just the encryption of process when accounts are being deleted and actively, and those admin credentials are in use. So this translates then into the attacker being able to do that data theft and impact and denial of service that's kind of core to their ransomware activity. To help understand what this looks like, I think it's useful to zoom back to this original cartoon, just because the trajectory here, even without getting into the specifics, is, I think, kind of the important thing to take away. Because ultimately, this started off like any other network-based attack, any other endpoint kind of traditional-based attack. Same kind of thing that you would have seen 5 years ago, frankly. But what got interesting is, because of that network attack, they gained access to cloud identity. That cloud identity was able to then access SaaS applications, M365 specifically. That cloud identity was also able to gain access to the PaaS, so the platform as a service aspect of Azure. That platform as a service aspect has control ultimately over the IaaS, which the attacker is then able to control and then take actions against. And so that's where they were able to then ultimately have impact on the data center, in the SaaS environment, in the platform as a service environment, and the IaaS environment, and really disrupt the operations of this organization. Vectra sees these types of attacks on a regular basis. This is because of how Vectra has developed our coverage for threat detection by putting basically the coverage where these attackers are active. So this means coverage for the network through kind of our NDR, coverage for the identity through our ITDR for both the network identity, so that's the AD identity, as well as the cloud actions, so through Azure AD or Entra AD. and then into the SaaS M365, and then into AWS and Azure and kind of even GCP from the IaaS perspective. This kind of what you're looking at here is an example of kind of a very similar type attack as the one I just played back for you, where the attacker landed in the network, gained access to credentials, pivoted through kind of an ADFS interaction to gain access to the cloud credentials, moved then into the cloud, started adding auth apps, manipulating Exchange, similar to what we just talked about, and then ultimately targeting AWS. In this scenario, because of Vectra's alerting, the entire attack was actually visible to a defender that from the very beginning, from the initial network compromise, but because of the visibility, the entire attack could be seen and played out in real time in order to allow kind of information gaining through kind of monitoring here. No damage ultimately is done because Vectra is seeing the full attack play out here.
Great. Thank you, John, for another wonderful, insightful session about hybrid cloud environment and also the attacker behavior on that. One quick question, and that sometimes we hear that from talking to defenders as well. Isn't it the cloud provider's job to protect these environments?
So I think it's important to always remember that there's a shared responsibility model in place with any of these cloud providers. So while the cloud provider is responsible for protecting the kind of core actual physical infrastructure, they've got really, really tight security in those data centers. Ultimately, it's the defender's responsibility or the organization using those services responsibility to protect the kind of interaction points within those environments. So when your credentials are the one working in it, it's on you as a defender or as an organization to protect and kind of respond to an attack in that space.
Yeah, yeah. And what about the native tools from these cloud solution providers? How are they different from what Vectra can do?
Yeah, so we're finding pretty consistently that just because of our focus in terms of breadth of multiple different attack surfaces, there's a huge value that we're able to provide to organizations over some of the native tools. By basically unifying these worlds, you get better signal and better opportunity to respond to these attacks. And ultimately, we're also focused just on deeper coverage through the use of AI that's able to surface more of these threats faster, ultimately, so defenders have a chance to respond and stop them.
Right. Great. Once again, thanks everyone for joining us. Hope to see you in the next episode. Thanks again, John.